Good afternoon, everybody. It's Debbie Evans here, and here's Rolo. As you can see, he's back in the storytelling chair. And today we'd like to bring you an exciting chapter from book 4. This is Jewel Dog and the Dragons, and it's all about King Alfred of Wessex, and Rolo finds out the truth about the burnt cakes. Rolo, settle down. Mum, why was King Alfred called Alfred the Great and not Alfred the First? Asked the floppy-haired boy. The smiley lady put a plate full of steaming shepherd's pie in front of him and took off her oven gloves. Good point. I've never really thought about it. I've no idea, she answered truthfully. Why don't you research it? I was sitting very quietly under the table with my feet gathered beneath me, doing what they both call clown eyes, hoping to get a spoonful of that shepherd's pie. The smiley lady went to the sink and filled the empty dish with soapy water. She must have seen me looking a bit crestfallen, as she then winked at me. She'd already put some in my doggy bowl to cool down and now placed this on the floor in front of me. After we'd finished dinner, there was a delicious aroma of freshly baked Welsh cakes coming from the kitchen. I watched the smiley lady roll the dough and use a glass to cut small circles out and then fry the second batch in hot butter on a griddle. Every now and then a bit of dough fell on the floor. I feel I earn my keep by being the canine vacuum cleaner. The kitchen floor is always spotless. All I remember about King Alfred is that he was supposed to have burnt the cakes, the smiley lady said. That night I took myself off to the forest to ask Athelstan, as he seemed to know everything about history. What do you know about King Alfred? What was so great about him? I asked. Well now, little pup, where to begin? He kept his kingdom of Wessex safe from the invading Vikings during his reign from 871 to 899. He changed the way the Anglo-Saxons fought, which helped defeat the enemy, and he unified the Saxons for the first time. Is that a good enough reason? Replied the sage dragon. Did he burn the cakes? I pressed. Well now, I think a trip to 9th century Wessex is in order. Instead of going through the time tunnel, Rydian will take you, and perhaps Gwyn as well. It's time he tested his wings, under supervision of course. It struck me that the wise tree dragon that as wise as the tree dragon was, he perhaps wasn't aware of Gwyn's solo adventure ending up in a red kite's nest. Stand back, incoming dragon, Athelstan roared, and instinctively I ducked between the oak tree roots, unsure of what was going to happen next. There was a great whooshing, followed by a flapping of powerful wings, and Rydian, the Welsh dragon, landed deftly in front of the tree where I had just been standing. If I'd stayed there, I would have been squashed. Nos da, Athelstan, Rydian boomed in greeting in his gruff Welsh language, and turning to me, gave a slight bow and said CM, which I remembered meant Jewel Dog. Formalities over, Rydian the great red dragon lay down flat on the forest floor and put his mighty tail out behind him like a drawbridge. I needed no second invitation. I went round to his tail end and ran up it like a ramp. This was much easier than trying to scramble onto the dragon's back from the bank of a ditch like I had last time I went for a dragon ride. I climbed over his rough scales up to his neck and tried to get comfy. The scales were hard and prickly, but I wasn't one to complain. Wait for us! I heard the tinkling voice of Yulia and was amazed to see her perched on Gwyn's back, holding her lantern high and steering him with small reins gathered in one hand. The woodland girl's face was a picture of concentration as they swooped in low through the trees to join us. Whoa, she soothed, pulling on the reins. They came into land in a much more ungainly fashion than the red dragon. Yulia did well to keep her seat. Row, burbled Gwyn. I think he was pleased to see me. We need to work on your landing skills a bit, said Yulia, repositioning herself on the young white dragon's back. I could see he was just the right size for her to ride. He certainly wasn't ready to take the weight of anything bigger yet. How are we to go back in history if we're not using the tunnel? I asked. I knew I'd travelled back to the Iron Age by dragon before, but I couldn't remember how we'd done it. Wait and see, said Athelstan with his customary mysteriousness. Well, that told me. I waited and watched. We bade farewell to the amused tree dragon. What do you know about King Alfred? I asked Julia when we were both airborne astride our dragons and clear of the trees. Only what Athelstan's told me. He was the youngest of 5 sons and probably never expected to rule. By all accounts, Alfred was very religious and possibly destined for the church. 3 of his brothers died. His ruling brother Ethelred of Wessex was having problems with the great heathen army. Who were they? I interrupted. The invading Vikings who came in longships, plundered coastal towns, settled without too much opposition in York, which they called Jorvik, and in East Anglia, Northumberland and Mercia, and now had their sights set on Wessex, she explained. Alfred distinguished himself in battle by leading an army on behalf of his brother the king, although he disliked war himself. What you might call a pacifist, I mused, eager to contribute. But surely there was enough manpower in Anglo-Saxon England to see off the marauders. The problem was, Paddy Bors, Julia continued, that in the 9th century, Saxony was split into different kingdoms, and each looked after their own. Most Saxon kings paid off the Vikings, so they would leave their territories in peace and go invade a neighbouring kingdom instead. The Vikings even managed to occupy some Saxon kingdoms and appointed puppet kings to rule from among the locals. There was no leadership and no unity until Alfred came to rule, following his brother Athelred's death, aged 21. She broke off and leaned forward to speak into the White Dragon's ear. Gwyn, you have to concentrate now. You've got to get this bit right or we'll be left behind. Follow the red dragon. The young white dragon slowed his pace a fraction and tucked in behind Ridian as instructed. What happened next, I'm not too sure about, as I felt a bit travel sick, but we seemed to ascend rapidly above the clouds, and as we wove in and out, we made a figure of 8 in the sky. I glanced behind to see if Gwyn had kept up, and sure enough, the white dragon's expression was focused on this tricky manoeuvre. I looked in a forward direction again as I didn't want to throw up, and then when we reached the point of the figure of 8 from where we had started, we suddenly swooped low under the cloud line. I heard Julia's voice anxiously call to her steed, "Remember to dip your wings." And sure enough, we'd done it, rolled back the centuries, and 2 dragons and their riders touched down in 9th century Wessex. The landing site was a bit boggy, and when I disembarked, I felt my paws sinking in the mud. I wondered where we were exactly. Ridian answered my thought. He seemed to have that same mind-reading power that Athelstan had. "Somerset Marshes, CM," he replied, "in the year 878, if we've done this right." What would happen next, I wondered. I could see armed men ranging about on the marshes, and by the looks of their weapons and the style of their helmets, they were Saxon. They wore rounded helmets which came right round their faces, covering their ears. The men carried wooden shields, axes, swords, spears, and some had bows and arrows. There were no signs of any horses. This Wessex army was made up of foot soldiers, which meant a battle might resemble a giant rugby scrum, with the addition of lots of shouting and lethal blows from heavy weapons. The Saxons appeared to be big, stocky men, more used to ploughing a field than wielding a sword, but with plenty of muscle power between them. Julia and the dragons went to find somewhere to hide, but I thought I'd hang about to get a better look. One of the soldiers spotted me, and I was immediately picked up by strong, rough arms, fussed and carried into a hut, where I was placed at the feet of none other than Alfred, the King of Wessex himself. My first impression was that the king didn't look too great. Pale, thin, and he kept clutching his stomach. He seemed to be in a lot of pain. I wondered if Yulia might be able to help him. She's good with healing herbs and nature and such like. I wondered if I could fetch her. The king was praying a lot and pacing around the room, completely ignoring me. I noticed a woman kneading dough on the wooden table close by. Flour was flying everywhere as she worked little balls of mixture and flattened them with her hand. She was working at great speed. I wondered if they were Welsh cakes like the Smiley Lady makes, or perhaps more accurately, these would be Wessex cakes. "Leave me now, I need to think," the king spoke gruffly. "But sire, I have just put these cakes in the oven," the woman protested. The soldier who had brought me indoors said, "Hush, Hilde, the king will see to the cakes, won't you, sire? Let's leave him be." And with that, the pair left the dwelling without a backward glance. Alfred lay down on a pallet of straw and clutched his stomach. I jumped up beside him and snuggled in like I do when the floppy-haired boy doesn't feel very well. The king's frown turned to a weak smile, and I found we could converse. He didn't seem surprised by this. "You seem troubled, sire. Is it the impending battle?" I asked. The king shared his thoughts with me. "The problem with the Vikings is that they are stealthy, like thieves in the night. They come in their longships and land on our coasts, plunder our villages, and when they move across the land, they move quickly, like lightning. They are unstoppable, motivated by greed and love of treasure. They're even settling on our beloved land. I can't keep calling the men away from the fields they tend every time there's a raid, and I can't afford to keep a standing army. But I will not have the Vikings settle here in Wessex. What to do?" he pondered. "Well, why don't you engage half the men to fight with you when necessary and leave half at home to tend the crops? That way you have a regular army ready to muster at once should the need arise." The king looked at me with amazement. "That's a brilliant idea. I'll create an army mobilised from free men to defend their shire. It will be called a fyrd." "Well done. What's your name?" "Rolo," I answered. "I shall make you a thane, Rodor." "Rodor? And what's a thane? Some sort of cake, perhaps?" I hoped so, but felt it impolite to ask. Instead, I said, "Why do you call me Rodor?" "Because you came from the sky, and because of your wisdom, I shall make you one of my noblemen." Aha, so that's what a thane was. Well, if Alfred saw me arrive from the air, he must have seen the dragons too. And then, as though reading my thoughts, the king said, "We have a red and a white dragon around here. Are they the two that brought you to me? Are you a gift from the dragons?" This news was astonishing. Dragons here too? I wasn't quite sure how to respond, so I just crossed my paws and did clown eyes. "I have a plan for keeping our realm safe from invaders, but I've not told anyone yet," he said, and went on to explain to me his theory about burhs. "My plan is to make garrisons in every town in Wessex." "What does that mean?" I interrupted. "Fortifying the marketplaces, and men will be given plots of land in exchange for their muscle power, defending the town in time of war. If I can create these burhs in key places, then neighbouring villages will also come under the protection of their nearest burh, and we will have a realistic and strong network of defence against the Vikings whenever they dare to plunder. I will also use this fyrd system of half army, half labourer in time of battle, as we have just discussed. And I have another plan hatching in my mind. I shall keep a written record of the size of each town, the number of men required to maintain its defence, and the length of the ramparts needed, and so forth." He paused. "A sort of blueprint for each town within the kingdom?" I encouraged. "Yes, Rodor, that's exactly what I mean. This will help future kings with their planning. I've started this experiment already, spreading out from my palace in Winchester to neighbouring towns, and I intend to take the defence plan around the kingdom and even to adjoining ones if it's successful. I've heard a rumour that even our old enemy, the Welsh, want an alliance with me. That would certainly give this land greater power. Come what may, we will defeat these Vikings. I have such long-term plans." The king's face crumpled with pain and he stopped tickling my ears to clutch at his stomach again. I came here with someone who might be able to help you, sire, I said, and explained about Julia with her knowledge of nature. The king nodded his consent, and I bounded out from the dwelling towards the woods, watching out for roaming Vikings. What's the rush, Paddy Paws? We've just spotted some pesky dragons fighting overhead. Rydian wants to have a word with them, said Julia when I found her in the trees. I explained about the king's discomfort, and the woodland girl, instructing Rydian to keep a close eye on Gwyn, immediately started foraging for herbs, comfrey, borage, and some others I'd never heard of, and didn't know what they looked like, so I couldn't be of much help. I ran around the woods following the scent of deer, rabbits, and marking the trees. I saw Julia with a bunch of greenery in her arms and watched her speak further with Rydian. I showed her the king's dwelling. Julia entered clutching the leaves and immediately wrinkled her nose at the terrible smell of burning. The king jumped up. I forgot all about the wretched cakes. He wrapped his royal hands in his cloak and quickly removed the smoking tray from the top of the open fire, and threw the charred offerings down on the table. They flew off the tray. Even I would turn up my nose at burnt cakes. I didn't think Hildy would be too impressed. Right, let's sort you out first, sire, and then we'll see about the cakes. Julia immediately took charge. The woodland girl scurried around the crude Saxon kitchen and was soon chopping and then pounding the herbs with a flint pestle and mortar she found on a shelf, adding water from a pitcher to make a drinkable potion. It was green and looked like it had come from the bottom of a pond. Rather him than me. King Alfred grimaced, and Julia pinched his nose and told him to drink it down like a good boy. He obeyed the bossy girl and soon fell into a deep sleep, and by the look on his face was temporarily free of pain. Julia set about making another batch of cakes, whirling round the kitchen and gathering up the ingredients which had been left out by Hilda's rapid departure. The woodland girl assured me as she baked that the king would recover his health and go on to do many great things. Famously, he would initiate the translation of important texts from Latin into Old English, making them accessible to his men, thus helping to improve their minds so they could live worthy and informed lives. This Christian king will unite the Saxons and lay the foundation of a code of law, Julia continued. This I believed because of the passion with which Alfred spoke. Julia picked up the skillet, filled it, flattened dough circles, and put it on the grate over the fire. Athelstan told me that during parleys with the enemy, Alfred had great success converting pagan leaders to Christianity, and sometimes even stood as godfather to their children when he baptized them. But of course, all of this is in his future. I was beginning to understand Alfred's greatness. Hopefully sleep would ease the king's pain and help clear his mind. Julia had just retrieved the new batch of cakes when Hildy came through the door with a rabbit for the royal dinner. She put the rabbit on the flower-covered table ready to skin and stew, smiled approvingly at the warm cakes, and went over to check on the sleeping king. His face had taken on a rosy hue. We bundled up the burnt cakes in a cloth and scarpered. She didn't take any notice of us. We made for the woods in search of Rydian and Gwyn. Overhead there was an almighty din. I looked up and saw 4 dragons, 2 red and 2 white. One a fair bit smaller than the others and trailing tiny reins. The dragons seemed to be having a great game of air tag, swooping low and flying up high, breathing fire and mock fighting. What are they up to? I asked Julia. Well, I had suggested that they put on a bit of a pantomime to scare off the invaders, she said. It seemed to be working. The Vikings were fleeing. We watched big burly men with plaited beards and ponytails poking out from their pointed helmets, waving long swords and running for the hills, screaming like banshees. The dragons came down to land in a clearing away from the hut and out of sight from the Wessex men, who were rubbing their hands with glee. They had won this battle without too much fighting and no loss of life, although to hear them you would think they'd won the skirmish on their own merit without the help of dragons. Those Vikings will be halfway back to their base at Chippenham by now, I heard one say, but no doubt they'll be back. The dragons were breathless and chuckling, boasting about their abilities to scare men and turn a battle. They were also ravenously hungry. Yulia threw the burnt cakes on the ground, and all four set upon them as if they hadn't eaten for a week. Relaying the story of our adventure to Athelstan, he enlightened me that Alfred's burhs evolved into what we know today as boroughs, and that most of the garrisoned towns eventually became the county towns of England. I also learnt that Alfred was a strategist, thinking beyond his own borders, and in his 28-year reign he successfully unified the different kingdoms into a more efficient Anglo-Saxon England. Most importantly, he halted the Viking advance. Alfred's legacy was truly great, and I was lucky to have been able to witness this firsthand. "Did you find out any more about King Alfred?" asked the smiley lady when the floppy-haired boy came home from school the next day. "Well, he was local," the floppy-haired boy replied, throwing his bag down in the hallway. "Born in Wantage, died in Winchester. Apparently there weren't any burnt cakes. That's just a story," he added. There are times when I really wish I could speak to my humans. So thank you very much for listening today. Rolo and I will be back tomorrow, same time, 3:15 on this Facebook page. I'm just going to show you what Rolo's been up to since I started reading. He obviously got fed up with listening to me. So here he is. Still here, but he'd moved off my lap. But we'll be back tomorrow. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.